Hello, and welcome back to the Book of Revelation Historicist View. This is part 12, An Army of Locusts, and we are Lebanon Springs House Ministries. I'm so glad you've joined me today. Now, I want to take just 30 seconds to review our last video. We saw the first 4 trumpets fulfilled by barbarian invasions into the Roman Empire from 378 to 476 AD. We saw Alaric and his Goths satisfying the destruction of 1/3 of the Roman Empire's trees and green grass through famine. We saw Genseric and his Vandals meet the conditions of destruction of 1/3 of the Roman Empire's sea and shipping through maritime piracy and naval operations. Attila and his Huns fulfilled the requirement of embittering the waters because they principally battled in that part of the Roman Empire where the rivers and fountains have their origin, potentially making them deadly when consumed. And finally, we saw the Germans under Odoacer dousing the light of 1/3 of the Roman Empire by deposing the last Western Roman emperor and launching Europe, and the world really, into the Dark Ages. The light of religion, the light of learning, and the light of civilization were snuffed out for a time. And here we remember the map revealing the portion of the Roman Empire that was affected by each of the first 4 trumpets, approximately 1/3 of the empire. Now today, as promised, we'll take a look at the 5th trumpet and discuss how it toppled yet another third of that empire. But first, we have verse 13 from chapter 8. John records, "And I beheld and heard an angel flying through the midst of the heavens, saying, Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth by reason of the other voices of the trumpet of the angels which are yet to sound." Now John is talking about trumpets number 5, 6, and 7, and we know this because he's actually going to tell us that a little further along. But Christine Miller explains that a possible reason that these trumpets are also referred to as the woe trumpets. She says the judgments so far are aimed at an entity, not individuals. But the woes are to the inhabitants of the earth or individuals. She says life is about to get hard for Joe Q. Public. Now there's a lot happening in this 5th trumpet, so we're going to break down all of the symbolism in the first few slides, and then we'll cover the interpretation, and I'll remind you which symbols that we're actually interpreting as we go along. And we're going to find the first set of symbols in verses 1 and 2. Let's read that together. "And the 5th angel sounded, and I saw a star fall from heaven unto the earth, and to him was given the key of the bottomless pit. And he opened the bottomless pit, and there arose a smoke out of the pit, as the smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air were darkened by reason of the smoke of the pit." Now perhaps you remember that I told you we would be seeing more examples of the fulfillments of these judgments, claiming to be an agent of God. And well, when the truth is that these judgments are being dispatched from the throne of God to his enemies and the enemy of his people, so their claims aren't entirely untrue. But looking at these symbols, we have seen a fallen star before, but this angel falls from heaven as opposed to the angel in Revelation 20 verse 1 who comes down from heaven. Both of them have the key to the bottomless pit. So really, to discern the difference here, we have to look at these Greek words that John is using. The word falls is the Greek word pipto. It's number 4098, and it means to fail, to fall down, as in oops. Whereas the angel in Revelation 20 comes down, and that word is katabaino, number 2597, and it means to go down or to descend. Now this probably sounds familiar to you because in chapter 4 we talked about anabaino when John was told to come up here. Remember, we discussed whether or not that was the rapture. Well, there's a difference, a distinction I believe John is making here between this angel in chapter 9 falling or failing versus that angel in chapter 20 that is descending from heaven. Now, as far as the bottomless pit, that is really 2 Greek words, and I'm going to look at those words first, and then we'll address this quote by gotquestions.org. Bottomless in the Greek is abyssos. It's where we get our English word abyss, and it means depthless or the deep. Pit is frere, and it's a hole, cistern, or well, figuratively as a prison. Why? Because cisterns hold water. It's a holding place. And hence the reference to Tartarus from gotquestions.org. They say the bottomless pit may be associated with a place called Tartarus. This Greek word is translated as hell and is used only once in Scripture in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4. It refers to the place where angels who sinned are reserved in chains of darkness for judgment. Now, why the connection between the bottomless pit and this place, Tartarus? Because in Greek mythology, it was the name of the underworld. And Got Questions says that it's an unfathomably deep prison. They say the word abyss simply means a deep hole, so deep that it seems bottomless or immeasurable. The word is often used in modern contexts to describe the sea. In the Bible and in Jewish theology, the abyss is often a metaphorical reference to the place of evil spirits. Sometimes the abyss is pictured as a deep or bottomless hole in the earth. In Revelation, a number of times we see the abyss as a place of confinement for evil spirits. Now, concerning the smoke as of a great furnace, our 18th century Bible commentator Adam Clarke says this is false doctrine, obscuring the true light of heaven. Matthew Henry joins in. He says, the devil carries on his designs by blinding the eyes of men. And John Gill says, Christ, the Son of Righteousness, was greatly obscured by the Romish Antichrist's false doctrine and worship. And finally, Christine Miller says, this is a powerful representation of confusion. We still say when our mental faculties are dulled that our brains are in a fog. She says it's an inability to see truth. Our next set of symbols come from verses 3 and 4. And there came out of the smoke locusts upon the earth, and unto them was given power, as the scorpions of the earth have power. Now we'll address the power of the scorpion momentarily because John's going to actually give us more information. And it was commanded them that they should not hurt the grass, neither any green thing, neither any tree, but only those men which have not the seal of God in their foreheads. Now this group should sound familiar to us because in chapter 7, during the first interval, we saw all 12 tribes of Israel being sealed in the forehead with the seal of the living God. So it's going to be interesting to see why is it these locusts cannot hurt that group. So again, looking at these symbols, Mr. Barnes begins by saying locusts are an emblem of desolation or destruction. They seem to devour not so much from a ravenous appetite as from a rage for destroying. They become therefore a most striking symbol of an all-devouring army, and as such are often referred to in Scripture. Now, as far as these locusts not eating grass, Christine Miller says the symbolism of the army of locusts is especially interesting. We know this is not an army of natural locusts, for this army does not harm any green thing, which is not what natural locusts do. Natural locusts are complete in their destruction of any and every vegetation, even to the doors on houses. Now, this group not being hurt, Matthew Henry suggests that heresy is a poison in the soul, working slowly and secretly, but will be bitterness in the end. He says these locusts had no power so much as to hurt those who had the seal of God in their foreheads, because God's electing, effectual, distinguishing grace will preserve his people from total and final apostasy. Mr. Henry is suggesting this group is supernaturally protected. In verses 5 and 6 we find 3 more symbols. And to them it was given that they should not kill them, but that they should be tormented 5 months. And their torment was as the torment of a scorpion when he strikes a man. And in those days shall men seek death, and shall not find it, and shall desire to die, and death shall flee from them. This is very specific information. And remember, John is receiving this around 96 AD, and we're already well into the 5th century. So it's going to, again, be interesting to find out how it is that they want to die but are unable. And when we look at these symbols, Matthew Henry suggests that the poison given to these factors for hell, these locusts, it's limited in point of time. It's 5 months. It's a certain season, but it's a short season. As far as their sting, Mr. Barnes says the sting of the scorpion, though exceedingly painful, is not usually fatal. The proper fulfillment of this would be found in what would not be generally fatal, but which would diffuse misery and wretchedness. And again, Mr. Barnes says it's very easy to conceive of such a state of things as here described, and indeed this has not been very uncommon in the world. It's a state where the distress is so great that people would consider death a relief. Now verses 7 through 10 is where we get our first real description of these beings. John tells us that the shapes of the locusts were like unto horses prepared unto battle. They had crowns like gold on their heads. Their faces were as the faces of men, and they had hair as the hair of women. Their teeth were as the teeth of lions, and they had breastplates as it were breastplates of iron. The sound of their wings was as the sound of chariots, and they had tails like unto scorpions. Now this is where many of us imagine a demonic hybrid type of being, right? But is this what John is really conveying to us? And in verse 11, we're told that they have a king over them. The angel of the bottomless pit, whose name in the Hebrew tongue is Abaddon, but in the Greek tongue has the name Apollyon. Now, we've seen before how names can transfer across different languages. But here in the Greek New Testament, we see the Hebrew word Abaddon. We know it's the Hebrew word because it's in the Old Testament, H11. It's the same word, and that shows up in the books of Job, Psalms, and Proverbs. And every time it does, it means to destroy or destruction. When we get to the transliteration, if you will, of that Hebrew name into Greek, we see Apollyon. And that's a different Greek word, 623. But when we go to that Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament, we find a related word, Apollia, and it shows up 365 times in the Old Testament as a verb meaning to destroy. So clearly, Abaddon and Apollyon are linked, and the connection is destruction. And remember, this is the name of that angel who opens the bottomless pit. If you recall, early on we talked about angels, and we mentioned Abaddon or Apollyon, and I guess the jury was still out as to whether this was a bad guy or a good guy. And really, I think the important thing is here is understanding that he has the permission to loose these locusts, and we'll see him again in just a bit. Okay, if we're going to recap the fifth trumpet symbolism, it begins with a star falling from heaven, and he opens up the bottomless pit from which a great smoke arises and an army of locusts who do not eat green grass, and they look somewhat demonic, right? They can torture men for 5 months, and it's very painful misery. And yet they can't touch this group who have been sealed in their foreheads. And those who do suffer want to die but are unable to find relief. And they have a king over them. Well, we have to ask, what is the history behind this fifth trumpet? And many people can't even imagine historical facts that might match such a fanciful interpretive description. We shall see. So we arrive at the historicist view or interpretation of the fifth trumpet. And again, we're going to take this symbol by symbol. So in verses 1 and 2, I'll remind you that we are looking at the fallen star, the bottomless pit, and this great smoke arises. Now, Christine Miller tells us that it was the unanimous opinion of the Protestant theologians before the advent of the futurist interpretation of Revelation that these passages describe the rise of Islam. But how is it that Muhammad and Islam can fulfill the fifth trumpet from 612 to 762 AD? We have to link that to these symbols. Let's begin with that fallen star. How are they linked? Well, we're going to use a number of different and varying resources to prove that out, beginning with this sketch on the left. This was done by Rashid al-Din Tabib in 1307. It's part of a work called Jami al-Tawarik. Rashid started out to write a history of the Persian Empire. He ended up really writing a history of the whole world from creation until his time. He opened a school, he gathered many talented calligraphers, and they drew the history of the world. And on the right you will see an excerpt from alislam.org, an article entitled The Birth of Islam and the Proclamation by Muhammad of His Mission. You'll see we're going to use many of Islamic resources in their own words, proving out this historicist view. So we have the picture, the sketching that's been around a long time, and then we'll have these words which tells us this is the history. When Muhammad was 40 years old, he was commanded by God through his angel Gabriel to declare his oneness to the idolaters and polytheists of the whole world, and to deliver the message of peace to an embattled humanity. In response to this command of heaven, Muhammad launched the momentous program called Islam, which was to change the destiny of mankind forever. They continue. He was in Hira when one day the archangel Gabriel appeared before him and brought to him the tidings that God had chosen him to be the last messenger to this world, and had imposed upon him the duty of leading mankind out of the welter of sin, error, and ignorance into the light of guidance, truth, and knowledge. But it's Christine Miller who reminds us a fallen star is a spiritual power of demonic nature in the book of Revelation. Muhammad claimed to have received the revelation of Islam from an angel in 609 AD. I guess the question remains, was that Gabriel or someone else? Now, as to this great smoke as of a great furnace rising up out of the pit, how is this linked to Muhammad and Islam? Well, Chinadu Daniel Abbasi wrote a book in 2018 entitled The Green Sabbath and the Last Vista of Hope, where he talks about John's revelation. He says, let's look at some of the details of John's vision and see how it describes the rise and spread of Islam. He says, we're told that the army of locusts came forth from a dark cloud of smoke that rolled out of the bottomless pit. In Greek, bottomless pit is abyssos, the source of our English word abyss. That's why some English Bibles translate it as simply the abyss. He goes on to say, though, that it is remarkable that Abul Ala Maududi, one of Islam's most prominent scholars of the 20th century, used the very word abyss when writing about the beginnings of Islam. In a book written to introduce English-speaking people to the basics of Islam, Maududi tells his readers that Muhammad and his message came out of Arabia, the abyss of darkness. Now, a few moments ago, John Gill had mentioned that this great cloud of darkness represented the false doctrines of the Pope. He expands a little further here. He says, truth was greatly obscured also by Muhammad, who represented Christ as a mere man and exalted himself above Christ as a prophet. And by him was the air, or the church, which receives its light from Christ, darkened. He says, or the scriptures, which are the breath of God and are given by inspiration of him. These were most grievously beclouded and most wretchedly perverted by the decrees of the popes and the Quran of Muhammad. And Christine Miller tells us that Arabia, as a province of the Roman Empire, contained many Christian and Jewish communities at Muhammad's birth in 570 AD, but by the time of his death in 632, it had been completely unified under Islam, and those who did not convert were driven off, killed, or laid under tribute. She says the light of the gospel had been extinguished by the military force of the converts to the new religion. Now, in verses 3 and 4, we saw the symbols of the locust, who do not eat grass, and they cannot hurt those who are sealed with the seal of God. To which Mr. Barnes replies, the whole scene now is changed. Rome has fallen. It has passed into the hands of strangers. The power that had spread itself over the world has, in that form, come to an end, and is to exist no more, though, as we shall see in Revelation 11, another power quite as formidable existing there is to be described by a new set of symbols. But here in Revelation 9, a new power appears. The scenery is all oriental and clearly has reference to events that were to spring up in the east. Mr. Barnes says with surprising unanimity, commentators have agreed in regarding this as referring to the empire of the Saracens, or to the rise and progress of the religion and the empire set up by Muhammad. As already remarked, the scene is oriental, for the mention of the locusts naturally suggests the east, that being the part of the world where they abound, and they being in fact especially an oriental plague. He says it may now be added that in a more strict and proper sense, Arabia may be intended, or the gathering of the hosts of Arabia for conquest. It was the east wind which brought the locusts on Egypt, and they must therefore have come from some portion of Arabia, for Arabia is the land that lies over against Egypt in the east. Such, too, is the testimony of Volney, the most judicious, as Mr. Gibbon calls him, of modern travelers. The inhabitants of Syria, says he, have remarked that locusts come constantly from the desert of Arabia. As some confirmation of this, or as showing how natural the symbol would be, a remark may be introduced from Mr. Forster. In his Mohammedanism Unveiled, Volume 1, page 217, he says, quote, in the Bedouin romance of Antar, the locust is introduced as the national emblem of the Ishmaelites. He goes on to say it's a remarkable coincidence that Mohammedan tradition speaks of locusts having dropped into the hands of Muhammad, bearing on their wings this inscription, "We are the army of the great God." Now, John Buckley was a professor at UCLA for 35 years, and he wrote many books. In his Prophecy Unveiled, he addresses how Islam is connected to these locusts who don't eat grass. He says, once again, Islam connects itself to these prophecies by the words of its own literature. Concerning trees and vegetation, the Quran says, when you fight the battles of the Lord, destroy no palm trees, nor burn any field of grain, cut down no fruit trees. And then he quotes commentator Albert Barnes. This precept is the more remarkable because it has been the usual custom in war, and particularly among barbarians and semi-barbarians, to destroy grain and fruit, and especially to cut down fruit trees in order to do the greater injury to any enemy. Now, we saw that with the first trumpet of Alaric. That was his point of cutting down trees, to harm the enemy. And here we see there is a prohibition. MuslimHeritage.com, in an article entitled Damascus by Salah Zemeki in 2005, undergird this. They say in the year 633, the 18th century historian Gibbon narrates, quote, Caliph Abu Bakr ascended the hill, reviewed the men, the horses, and the arms, and poured forth a fervent prayer for the success of their undertaking. He said, when you fight the battles of the Lord, acquit yourselves like men without turning your backs, but let not your victory be stained with the blood of women or children. Destroy no palm trees, nor burn any fields of corn, and cut down no fruit trees, nor do any mischief to cattle, only such as you kill to eat. And again, John Buckley addresses the fact that they do not harm those who are sealed with the seal of God. He says the seal of God, those with the seal of God were not to be killed according to Revelation 9, chapter 9, verse 4. Muslim armies were instructed by the Caliph Abu Bakr, Muhammad's successor, to not kill the humble, pious Christians who lived in monasteries. Concerning such Christians, the Muslim armies were told to let them alone and neither kill them nor destroy their monasteries. He says it's a well-known fact that the Muslims had deep respect for Saint Francis of Assisi. They likewise had respect for humble, sincere Christians in earlier centuries. Apparently, these were the Christians who, at least in the minds of Muslims, had the seal of God to protect them. Now, I want to address something that maybe you're already thinking. We know from history that the church is going to suffer from the hands of the Islamic warriors. And we have to ask, didn't the church have the seal of God on their foreheads? This is where it would be good to remember the parable of the wheat and the tares and how they look identical, but they're not. And to this, Adam Clarke suggests this would be all false, hypocritical, and heterodox Christians. And Christine Miller says the Mohammedan was commanded to let alone those who were living quiet and simple lives of piety. She says, I think those who were truly sealed with the seal of the living God on their foreheads went on living their simple and quiet lives, unvexed by the Mohammedans. They were content in whatever circumstance they found themselves in, trusting in the Lord their God in this life as well as the next. It's a very plausible suggestion that we're going to see many people in the church suffering at the hands of Islam, but not all. In verse 5, we saw the symbols of the 5 months of torment. And Christine Miller will begin this time. She says, the authority of the army of locusts was not to kill and take life, but to cause torment. As the sting of a scorpion is not usually fatal, but exceedingly painful, causing misery and suffering. She says this is true of the military conquest of Islam following the death of Muhammad. Their preference was to leave the populations of provinces and communities intact, seeking rather to change the religion of the conquered or to receive their tribute, rather than to take their lives. The Mohammedans, when they first aspired to overtake a new province, always offered friendship first. That is, if the king and people converted to Islam, then they were friends. But if the people of the book, as they called them, Christians and Jews, would not convert, then they were allowed to keep their religion with restrictions. No new churches could be built, witnessing was forbidden, holy day observances were restricted, and they were required to pay a tribute to the caliph. Albert Barnes says the meaning of this, if understood as applied to their commission against Christendom, would seem to be that they were not to go forth to kill, but to torment them. And as applicable to the conflicts of the Saracens with Christians, the meaning here would seem to be that the power conceded to those who are represented by the locusts was not to cut off and to destroy the church, but it was to bring upon it various calamities to continue for a definite period. He continues, accordingly, some of the severest afflictions which have come upon the church have undoubtedly proceeded from the followers of the Prophet of Mecca. There were times in the early history of that religion when, to all human appearance, it would universally prevail and wholly supplant the Christian church. But the church still survived, and no power was at any time given to the Saracenic hosts to destroy it altogether. In respect to this, some remarkable facts have occurred in history. Mr. Barnes goes on to describe that the followers of the prophet contemplated the subjugation of Europe altogether and the destruction of Christianity from two quarters, the east and the west. They actually twice attacked Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, but they were stopped and defeated and disgraced. They again renewed their attack on the west, but Charles Martel, or Charles the Hammer, is credited with stopping them and saving Europe and Christendom from subjugation all total. And many historians look back and think why it was that quick onset of conquering, as we'll see in a moment, just fizzled out. It just stopped short of doing what they had planned. And now we're going to address what it was like, those who did suffer from the scorpion sting, so to speak. Najib Salibah in 2008 wrote an article entitled Christians and Jews under Islam. We're going to delve into what it was like to live in an Islamic state. Quote, thus, in return for submission and the payment of the poll tax, Islam guaranteed the people of the book security of life, property, and protection in the exercise of their religions. Dhimmis, that's what they call non-Muslims, had full autonomy under the leadership of their religious status, such as marriage, divorce, and inheritance. So long as they submitted to the Muslim state and paid the poll tax, Christians and Jews were left alone to run their own lives without interference. New World Encyclopedia has an article entitled Dhimmi, again, the name given to non-Muslims living in the Islamic State. And they tell us that in general, the Muslim attitude toward Dhimmis was one of contempt instead of hate, fear, or envy, and was rarely expressed in ethnic or racial terms. In his classic treatise on the principles of Islamic governance, the 11th century scholar al-Mawardi divided the conditions attached to dhimma on top of the requirement to pay tribute into compulsory and desirable. The compulsory conditions included prohibitions on blasphemy against Islam, against entering into sexual relationships or marriage with a Muslim woman, against proselytizing among Muslims, and of course against assisting the enemies of Islam. The desirable conditions included a requirement to wear distinctive apparel, a prohibition to visibly display religious symbols, wine, pork, ringing of church bells, or loudly praying, and a requirement to bury dead bodies unobtrusively, and finally a prohibition on riding horses or camels, but not donkeys. The latter restrictions were largely symbolic in nature and were designed to highlight the inferiority of Dhimmis compared to Muslims. They continue. Many Dhimmis were executed as a result of accusations that they had insulted Islam. Although some deliberately sought martyrdom, many blasphemers were insane or drunk. It was not uncommon for the blasphemy accusation to be made due to political considerations or private vengeance, and the fear of a blasphemy charge was a big factor in the fearful and subservient attitude of Dhimmis towards Muslims. As Edward William Lane put it, describing his visit to Egypt, Jews scarcely even dare to utter a word of abuse when reviled or beaten by the meanest Arab or Turk, for many a Jew had been put to death upon a false and malicious accusation of uttering disrespectful words against the Quran or the Prophet. Now, verse 5 also contains the element of time, 5 months. And you'll remember that I told you we would be using the biblical prophetic principle of time. And that concept is found in the books of Numbers and Ezekiel. Our first example, this is where the Lord was telling Moses that they were going to have to wander the desert for 40 years because of their sin, because of their lack of faith, the bad report that the spies brought back from searching the land. He says, after the number of the days in which ye searched the land, even 40 days, each day for a year, shall ye bear your iniquities, even 40 years. So clearly here, 40 days equaled 40 years. We see this principle again in Ezekiel, and this is where the Lord is telling Ezekiel to portray for Israel and Judah, those northern and southern kingdoms, what their sin has brought about, what the punishment is going to look like. So he has to lie on his left side for a certain number of days for Israel's sin, and then turn and lie on his right side. Let's see what it says. And when thou hast accomplished them, lie again on thy right side, and thou shalt bear the iniquity of the house of Judah 40 days. I have appointed thee each day for a year. So again, 40 days, 40 years. Now, to apply this prophetic principle to the 5 months, we have to simply ask, how many years are 5 prophetic months? Now, let's first remember that this is how long they can torment, not how long they will exist as an entity. So applying that principle, if 1 day equals 1 year, 1 month equals 30 days, 5 months would be 150 days. Now, I'll stop right here and explain that this prophetic principle is based upon every month having 30 days, not like it is today, 29.5 or 31 days. This is what the principle is based off of. That's how you can get some of the numbers in the New Testament. So according to this principle, 5 months would be 150 years. That's how long these locusts can torment. Well, if we begin with Islam arising under Muhammad, that was the Umayyad dynasty in 612 AD, that's when he began preaching Islam. And if we add 150 years to that, we'll find out that that was the conquest period where 8 different Roman provinces fell to Islam. If we add that math, we come to 762 AD, which just so happens to be when the Abbasid dynasty took over and ended the conquest phase of Islam. That's fairly amazing that exactly 150 years between Muhammad and the Umayyad dynasty for all the conquering, and then the next dynasty to take place, and as we'll see in a minute, they were known for something else. If we accept that the Mohammedan armies were the army of the locusts, then we must begin counting time from 612. This is the year Muhammad began publicly preaching Islam after receiving the vision from the fallen angel. 10 years following the giving of the vision and the beginning of public preaching was the flight of the prophet in 622. This date is well established. Now, Muhammad was fleeing persecution, and that again is well established. By the time of Muhammad's death in 632, Arabia had become the first province under the rule of Islam, one former Roman province fallen. In 636, the capital of Jerusalem and Palestine and Syria came under rule of Islam, 2 more former Roman provinces fallen. Mesopotamia fell to Islam in 637, Egypt in 640, Persia in 641, and North Africa in 698, 4 more former Roman provinces fallen. In 711, Spain fell to Islam, a total of 8 Roman provinces fallen. Christine says, in 762, Baghdad was founded as the capital of the Abbasid dynasty of caliphates. The caliph was the successor of Muhammad. The Abbasid dynasty displaced the former dynasty, the Umayyads, the dynasty responsible for all the conquering which had been occurring beginning with Arabia. The Abbasid dynasty, on the other hand, was known for its pursuit of science, arts, and literature, not conquest. It just so happens that 612 to 762 is 150 years, the years from the beginning of Islam to the end of its conquering dynasty. Now, verse 6 had to do with men seeking death but not being able to find it. It's elusive. But before we go there, we need to talk about the time lapse between the 4th trumpet and the 5th trumpet. This is the first time where we have a considerable amount of time that has elapsed. Remember, the first 4 trumpets occurred within the span of just under a century, the last one being 476 AD. The 5th trumpet, we begin at 612 AD, and that's 136 years later, so that's well over a century between just the two. And it's a fair question to ask, what was happening in the Christian church in those intervening years? Well, for one, Benedict established the first order of monks. Now, he lived 480 to 543 AD. Columba, the Irish missionary to Scotland, founded a monastery on Iona in 563. But most importantly, Gregory the Great was Pope in Rome from 590 to 604. It's Christine Miller who tells us it was from his reign, Gregory the Great, that the Christian church really took on the identity of the Roman Catholic Church in government, administration, and influence that was to characterize it during the Middle Ages. This is why Gregory is known as the Great. Now remember, men would seek death but not be able to find it. And Christine Miller tells us that by the time Muhammad received his vision of Islam, every man in Christendom was born and baptized into the Roman Catholic Church, especially after the reign of Gregory the Great. It everywhere governed and influenced society. Membership was not voluntary as it is today. The notion of having a choice about it never entered anyone's mind. This is why the threat of excommunication was so effective. It essentially cut a person off from society. That person had no way to buy or sell, no way to conduct business, no way to work, and relationships with others were not possible, for the excommunicate was shunned completely. Now, clearly, we're going to be discussing some of the facets of the Roman Catholic Church, but we're going to save most of that for when we get to the chapters in Revelation that discuss the beast kingdom. For now, this is going to be the backdrop, though, of our fifth trumpet. Christine Miller continues, by 612, the prohibition against suicide was well established in the former territory of the Roman Empire, both east and west. Those who committed suicide could not receive Christian burial. Without Christian burial, it was believed, there could be no resurrection or salvation. A. van der Heeren, in an article entitled Suicide from the Catholic Encyclopedia, says that suicide is unlawful is the teaching of the Holy Scripture and of the Church, which condemns the act as a most atrocious crime, and in hatred of the sin, and to arouse the horror of its children, denies the suicide Christian burial. H. Thurston, also from the Catholic Encyclopedia on Christian burial, says further Christian burial is to be refused to suicides. This prohibition is as old as the 4th century. And then Mr. Thurston cites John Cassian for that reference. So this is definitely dating us that this prohibition to suicide was well established long before the fifth trumpet came along. And Rebecca McNamara from Psyche.co says suicide in medieval England was considered a felonious offense, the self-murder of the king's subject. So the crown confiscated that person's goods and chattels. This could leave some women whose fathers or husbands had died by suicide in dire straits, impoverished by the confiscation of goods and chattels and the loss of that man's future earnings. And Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy says the advent of institutional Christianity was perhaps the most important event in the philosophical history of suicide, for Christian doctrine has by and large held that suicide is morally wrong, despite, they say, the absence of clear scriptural guidance regarding suicide. Although the early church fathers opposed suicide, St. Augustine is generally credited with offering the first justification of the Christian prohibition on suicide. He saw the prohibition as a natural extension of the fifth commandment. Now, St. Augustine lived from 354 to 430 AD, again, fairly sealing the deal that this was in the minds of the people. They may be suffering, they may want to die, but they won't get to heaven, or so they think, if they commit suicide. And Why Suicide Was a Sin in Medieval Europe by Livia Gershon tells us, medieval Christian theologians were heavily influenced by Augustine of Hippo's writings on suicide, which he viewed as a form of murder, forbidden by the sixth commandment. From the 6th century on, the Catholic Church denied formal funeral rites to people who died by suicide. Talk about timing. Christine Miller finishes this with, thus in those days, people will seek death and will in no way find it. They will desire to die, and death will flee from them. Now, verses 7 through 11 is where we get this great description of these locust beings. And even though people want to fantasize on this hybrid type of demonic being, we're going to find out it was really much more of a practical description. John Buckley, in his prophecy Unveiled, again says, John's descriptions of the locusts' appearance sounds very much like history's description of the Muslim armies of Muhammad's day. The locusts were not just horses, but something more, like unto horses. And he quotes Adam Clarke, the Arabs are the most expert horsemen in the world. They lived so much on horseback that the horse and his rider seemed to make but one animal. This would account for John's description of the horse and rider as if they were one single being rather than two separate beings. And as for the crowns like gold Mr. Barnes offers, that is, diadems, or something that appeared like crowns or chaplets, this will agree well with the turban worn by the Arabs or Saracens, and which was quite characteristic of them in the early periods when they became known. So in the passage already quoted, Pliny speaks of them as Arabus Matrati. The Arabs wore turbans. Also in the poem of Antar, quote, he folded up his hair under his turbans. Mr. Forster, he says, in his Mohammedanism Unveiled, quotes as a precept of Mohammed, make a point of wearing turbans because it is the way of angels. Turbans might then with propriety be represented as crowns, and no doubt these were often so gilded and ornamented that they might be spoken of as crowns of gold. Now, what of those faces of men? Mr. Barnes says it's remarkable that the appearance of the Goths, represented as I suppose under the previous trumpets, is described by Jerome as quite the reverse. They're described as having faces shaven and smooth, faces in contrast with the bearded Romans like women's faces. Is it fancy, he asks, to suppose that the reference here is to the beard and mustache of the Arabic hosts? We know with what care they regarded the beard, and if a representation was made of them, especially in contrast with the nations that shaved their faces and who thus resembled women, it would be natural to speak of those represented in the symbols as having faces as the faces of men. How very interesting. He says this strictly accords with the appearance of the Arabs or Saracens. Pliny, the contemporary of John, speaks of the Arabs then as having the hair long and uncut, with the mustache on the upper lip or the beard. He next gives several quotes or excerpts from different writings. He adjusted himself properly, twisted his whiskers, and folded up his hair under his turban, drawing it off his shoulders. And his hair flowed down on his shoulders. And Antar cut off Maudi's hair in revenge and insult. And we will hang him up by his hair. Again, excerpts proving that, at least in Islamic literature, it's a given that they wore long hair and turbans. Now, what of those teeth of lions? Mr. Barnes says strong, suited to devour. The teeth of the locusts are by no means prominent, though they are strong, for they readily cut down and eat up all vegetable substances that come in their way. But, he says, it is evident that John means to say that there was much that was unusual and remarkable in the teeth of these locusts. They would be ravenous and fierce, and would spread terror and desolation like the lions of the desert. Now, one can hardly escape the understanding that terror and the Islamic hordes were synonymous, in the mind at least, of the Romans. Now for those breastplates of iron. As a symbol, this would be properly descriptive of the Arabians or Saracens. In the poem Antar, the steel and iron cuirasses of the Arab warriors are frequently noticed. A warrior immersed in steel armor. 15,000 men armed with cuirasses and well accoutred for war. They were clothed in iron armor and brilliant cuirasses. And my favorite, out of the dust appeared horsemen clad in iron. Again, Mr. Barnes lending us quotes showing that this was the understood appearance of the Islamic warriors. Now, perhaps you remember E.B. Elliott's Horai Apocalypticae. We spoke about it early on in this series. He describes the fifth or first word trumpet in this excerpt. He says, of the locusts appearing breastplated with iron, both Antar, the Quran, and the history of Muhammad and the early Muslim Saracens will also satisfy us. In Antar, the steel or iron cuirasses of the Arab warriors are frequently noticed. In the Quran, among God's gifts to the Arabs, their coats of mail for defense are specially particularized. And in Muhammad's history, we read expressly of the cuirasses of himself and his Arab troops. Mr. Elliot says, individual Arabs might not seldom astound the foe by their naked bravery, but the Saracen policy was the wearing of defensive armor. The breastplate of iron was a feature of description literally answering to the Arab warrior of the 6th or 7th century. And what about the sound of those wings sounding like chariots? The noise made by locusts is often spoken of by travelers, and the comparison of that noise with that of chariots rushing to battle is not only appropriate, but also indicates clearly what was symbolized. It was an army that was symbolized, and everything about them served to represent hosts of men, well armed, rushing to conflict. The same thing here referred to is noticed by Joel in chapters 2, verses 4, 5, and 7. You know, if you've never heard the sound of a swarm of locusts, I encourage you to Google that. It's quite astounding, and the description is very appropriate. And we finally come to the last detail of the description of this locust. It has a tail like a scorpion. Again, it seems fairly fanciful, but when you see the historical evidence behind it, it just makes sense. Now, we're told that the Parthian shot is a light cavalry hit-and-run tactic made famous by the Parthians, an ancient Iranian people. While performing a real or feigned retreat at full gallop, the horse archers would turn their bodies back to shoot at the pursuing enemy. The maneuver required superb equestrian skills, since the rider's hands were occupied by his composite bow and his body was twisted around. And this is a picture of an hepthalite bowl. I believe it's in the Egyptian Museum. Now, they were the Hunnic people, and this substantiates that this maneuver predated the Fifth Trumpet. But now we have to talk about the composite bow. Compared to other bows, the Chicago Hungarians tell us, the composite bow was smaller and more powerful and more practical in hunting or shooting from horseback. An arrow shot from it could travel about half a mile's distance. It was capable of piercing some light body armor and was lethal at about 300 to 400 yards. They tell us Western bows had only about half the range. The warriors of the East were masters in handling these bows, and they shot their arrows with great accuracy from their galloping horses. Even in a retreat, real or tactical, the stirrup enabled them to turn facing backwards on their horses, allowing for the very effective use of these weapons. Now, this is documented history, but can you imagine for a moment the Romans viewing this for the first time? I mean, the Roman army was the army of armies. They hadn't mastered these skills. It's really, truly an amazing description that John gave, that these locusts had power in their tails. In verses 11 and 12, this is where we find out that these locusts have a king. And we've already talked some about who that king is, or who that angel of the abyss is, I should say. We remember that his name Abaddon and Apollyon was linked to destruction. And when we look at Exodus chapter 12, this is about the Passover. The Lord passed through to smite the Egyptians. And when he saw the blood upon the lintel and on the 2 doorposts, Yahweh passed over the door and did not allow the destroyer to come into their houses and smite them. So many people want to make this angel over the bottomless pit, this king of the locust army, Satan, or perhaps Muhammad, who brought Islam. But the fact is that often the Lord used angelic beings to bring judgment or destruction. And GotQuestions.com, in asking who is this destroying angel, says he's also commonly referred to as the angel of death. On numerous occasions, God used angelic beings to bring judgment to sinners on earth. Various Bible translations refer to this being as a destroying angel. Interestingly, they say the original Hebrew text of Exodus 12 that we just looked at doesn't mention an angel at all. It simply says that the destroyer or the spoiler or the one who causes damage would slay the firstborn of Egypt. Clearly, the most important thing about these locusts are the fact that they've been kept under lock and key until the Lord decided it was time to let them loose. And next we are told that the first woe has passed and two more are coming. This would be trumpet number 6 and trumpet number 7. Now, quickly recapping the fifth trumpet symbolism, we find that the historical event of the rise of Islam best matches the details that John gives us in the first half of chapter 9 of the book of Revelation. A thorough examination of history reveals that Muhammad claimed to have received Islam from an angel of God. And Islamic practice, especially in its earliest form, was not to kill men, but to subjugate them through conversion or tribute. And in fact, the conquering phase or torment did indeed last for the prophetic 5 months, 150 years. The historical evidence that the emblem of early Arab people was the locust is also undeniable. And when you compare the descriptions given by John of this locust army to history's description of the Mohammedan armies, one can't help but see a striking resemblance both in appearance and behavior. And as for those 8 former Roman provinces that Islam subjugated, we find that their location also fits our expectation that this fifth trumpet would fell yet another third of the Roman Empire. Well, this wraps up Part 12, the Army of Locusts. Next time on the Book of Revelation, Historicist View, Part 13, the Euphrates Angels Loosed. We're going to see what history has to reveal about these 4 angels, and we're going to again look to the east to discover the identity of the 6th trumpet judgment. You know, I'm really excited about our next video. The symbols of this judgment, above all the others in my opinion, are the most corroborating of this historicist view. The historical detail promises to amaze. I hope that you can join me. But until then, stay well, keep studying, and shalom.